Thank you again for making the time and taking the time to join us and to listen in. You can certainly subscribe to the YouTube channel, Jay Fuller Interviews. Again, my name is Jeff Fuller, and you can find all things Jay Fuller Interviews, whether it's at YouTube, the Facebook group, Instagram, or Twitter, Jay Fuller Interviews, and now on all the podcast channels, whether it's Apple iTunes, Spotify, Anchor, or Google Podcasts, as the Backfire Podcast with Jeff Fuller of Jay Fuller Interviews. I certainly believe people's stories make our story better if we would just take the time to listen, to unlearn what we thought we knew and relearn what is truly true. And one with a great story now is Mr. John DeDakis. John, welcome in.
Thanks, Jeff. It's good to be here.
So I just want to get started. When I was researching Corinne McCandless, I could not locate any contact information of her. She did not respond to any social media, but I did find an interview that you had with her, the author of The Wild Truth, the sister of Christopher McCandless, John Krakauer's book, Into the Wild. Why did you bring Corinne into your program?
Well, because Corinne is an interesting person. I met her at a writers' conference at I think it was the Hampton Roads Writers' Conference, golly, probably maybe 10 years ago. And we struck up a friendship there. We've stayed in touch over time. And she actually was provided a blurb for me for my fourth novel, Bullet in the Chamber. And so we've been friends for a long time. And when I teach at the Muse, the writing center in Norfolk, Virginia, she and I usually get together and keep in touch as well. So she's been a longtime friend. And so I obviously, now that I started to do some of my own interviews, she was one of the go-to people I wanted to talk to, especially in light of the news that the bus in Alaska where her brother was found dead was moved from the location because it was in a dangerous location. People, could easily get trapped there. And so they moved the bus to another place. And so Corinne was involved in the relocation of that.
Absolutely phenomenal story. And you can find more information about that bus at friendsofbus142.com, friendsofbus142.com. John, as I looked at your website, but also your Wikipedia page, I just loved how it said your, now I forget, your grandfather or great-grandfather, when the D is pronounced or was written down, it looked more dignified. So they kept it with a capital D for the second D. Can you just talk about researching your family history and how much joy did that bring you, just finding these little tidbits and facts of information?
Well, and it's still an ongoing situation because I'm writing a memoir now, and all I have are some of the tidbits that my dad shared with me and my cousin Betty Gannis, and she's sort of the keeper of the family flame. But I learned that my dad came to the U.S. from Greece in about must have been about 1913, and the name was Ellis Islanded to DeDakis. And my dad grew up in Chicago. In an early Chicago phone book, the DED, the second D was capitalized by mistake. And so my grandpa, my papu, changed, basically said, "Oh, that's cool," or whatever the Greek equivalent is of that. And so our particular strain of the family of DeDakis will capitalize the second D. Although there are other people, other DeDakises who keep that second D small.
And John, you certainly are a fascinating person. Just as I mentioned before, coming across your website through just meeting Corinne McCandless, you've done a lot of things, of which Fake is a new book that has been completed. People can order that for the Christmas holiday shopping season. But when did you first begin writing? When did you know that you wanted to be an author?
Oh, I think that the interest in being an author goes way back to before I even went to school, to elementary school, because my parents had, a library of books in their
Again, John DeDakis, making some time. You can find him.
think our I think our
Maltese.
in yeah, I think our internet is a little sketchy at the moment.
That's welcome back. You were just sharing becoming an author, and just talking about, is that something you wanted to do as a child, or when did that all come into play?
I think it did. It goes way back to before I even went to grade school, and I was enthralled by the books that my parents had in the at home, and so I began to, try to emulate some of the writing that I saw on the page. Um, I think, though, the ideas evolved over time as you determine, what your personal calling is in life. And so, without going into a lot of detail, I went into journalism. I was going to be a lawyer like my dad and ended up getting into journalism. And it wasn't until probably about 1990 ish, something like that. I was at CNN in Atlanta as a writer, and I became an editor. But editing was tedious. It paid well, but it was tedious, and it was more fault finding. And so I needed a
Hmm.
creative outlet. And that's when I began to experiment with fiction.
And according to your website, you were able to interview, was it Alfred Hitchcock when you were
Right.
young? Could you just share that story, and how did that all come about?
Well, this was during the Vietnam War, and back then they had a draft, and if you had a draft number below 150, chances are you were going to get drafted and plucked from society and sent to the jungles of Vietnam. My number was 14, so it didn't look good. I enlisted in order to avoid the draft so that I'd have more control over what I'd do, and I enlisted for military journalism, and I had orders to Vietnam. But talk about a plot twist. 2 weeks before I was to ship out, my orders were changed from Vietnam to Germany.
Hmm.
And I spent the next 2.5 years at the headquarters of the American Forces Radio and Television Network, AFN, in Frankfurt. And my boss, Herb Glover, had worked at CBS News with Walter Cronkite. He was my boss in a special events radio unit, and one of the first interviews he assigned me to do was with Alfred Hitchcock. And that was really a mentoring moment because Herb could have done the interview in his sleep. And instead, he very generously threw that bone to me. And it was pivotal because I found what I was good at and what I loved. And when you put those two things together, you've really got some purpose going forward in life. So that's how it came about.
How familiar were you with Alfred Hitchcock? Did you have to do a lot of research, or was he kind of an idol hero that you already knew a lot of information about?
Well, he was definitely a big name back. This would have been in 1972 or three, and he was promoting his one of his later movies, Frenzy. And I became familiar with Hitchcock when he produced Alfred Hitchcock Presents on CBS
Hmm.
television. But of course, I'd been familiar with some of his movies, but not all of them. So I knew a bit about Hitchcock, but there was still a lot I didn't know about him, and so I did some research as well, and that actually came in handy during the interview.
Now, the Vietnam War, crazy time. I also read that you took part in or covered some of the riots that have taken place way back when, and now 2020 it seems not dissimilar to where we should have come from, grown from years gone past. But looking back at those times when in the 70s, when you were covering the riots, what did you learn from those times that helped you process this year?
Ooh, that's an intriguing question. That back then, it was as if the country was tearing itself apart. I went to college in 1968, and that year, LBJ on March 31st, 1968, announced that he was not going to run for reelection as president because of the Vietnam War. He wanted to devote his time to ending the war. And not that he was really successful in doing that. In April of 1968, Martin Luther King was assassinated. 2 months later, Bobby Kennedy was assassinated while running for president. And college campuses were just in turmoil because of the anti-war rioting that was going on. Then it intensified as we got to about 1970 in the Kent State Massacre, when National Guard troops fired live ammunition into anti-war protesters. In fact, some of the people who were killed weren't even protesting, and these were not rioters. And so and so this was a time when Nixon was president, and he was using his vice president, Spiro Agnew, as a hatchet man to go after the news media. And in speeches around the country, Spiro Agnew called journalists nattering nabobs of negativism and an effete corps of impudent snobs, which is sort of elegant way of saying fake news.
Yeah.
And, my parents were, Nixon Republicans. And so when it became apparent that I was going to join the dark side, and instead of going into practice with my dad, going into his law practice with him, instead I went into journalism, my mom basically said, if in your reporting I hear any bias, even if it's an opinion I agree with, you failed. Just give me the facts and let me make up my own mind. And that is what basically guided me in my 45-year career in journalism.
So how have you been able to process the social unrest, injustice this year through that lens of how your mom instructed you when you were younger?
Well, the interesting thing is that now we are living in alternate universes because we no longer agree on what the facts are. And that's very troubling. And I think one of the reasons that's happened is that now, with the proliferation of social media, anyone with a cell phone or a laptop is a journalist, because as soon as you push send, you are publishing. The difference is there's no editor standing next to you saying, where'd you get that? How do you know that's true? So there's no fact checking in the publication process. And the problem is that a lot of the people who are promiscuously sending out false information are at the same time casting aspersions on the credibility of mainstream journalism, which has checks and balances on the information that is published. And so and then that is magnified by a president who basically calls journalists the enemies of the American people. And when you have someone in that position undermining the integrity of not just journalism, but science, the intelligence community, the judiciary, that's very dangerous. And so that's why we're where we are now, where we're living in alternate universes. And we have millions and millions, tens of millions of people who still believe that this election was stolen by the Democrats and that Trump won and that the election was stolen from him, even though those allegations have never been proven in court. Yeah. All of those allegations have been thrown out except for one.
John DeDakis makes some time, johndedakis.com. Can you just share about your most recent book, Fake? And how long did that take you to write? And why should our listeners purchase that this holiday season?
Well, I wouldn't want to get into the shoulds because it's a free country and you don't have to buy it. I started writing it when there it is right there. I started writing it when Trump was elected president because I was troubled by this whole fake news, enemies of the American people. But I didn't write it in order to have it be an anti-Trump polemic, because what I really wanted to show is the consequences of unvetted information on the internet that's untrue, that can still have consequences. So my protagonist, Lark Chadwick, is a White House correspondent for the Associated Press, and she becomes a victim of fake news. And so that's what I really wanted to get across, the consequences of going forward when we don't trust what had been considered reliable sources of information.
Very interesting. John, I grew up in a very Republican home when I was younger, and I noticed that you were around and covered the presidency of Ronald Reagan. That was certainly held in high esteem in our family. Can you just talk about those years, those moments, and how things have changed or become so polarized since his presidency?
Well, things things were polarized back then too. Um, I did a piece on the press versus the presidency because of this whole media bias allegation that was going around. And so I tried to, I'm getting a spam call from Georgia, the election. They want me to contribute money to the senatorial campaigns, whatever. Sorry about that.
That's okay.
Anyway, um, so I lost my train of thought. We're talking about Reagan and his presidency.
Yeah.
So I did a piece on the press corps versus the president. And one of the things I discovered and was able to report on is that by nature, the relationship between the press and the president is adversarial. And I interviewed Sam Donaldson, who was the ABC White House correspondent, and he summed it up really well. He said, it's Larry Speake's job. Larry was the White House press secretary. He said, it's Larry's job to make the president's policies look perfect. It's our job as reporters to find out what's really going on. And that is by nature the tension that goes on in any administration. It has always been that way, where reporters are trying to find out what's really going on, and the president and his people are trying to spin it so that it's presented as perfectly as possible.
What opened the door for you to join CNN?
Well, let's see. I was working at the Christian Broadcasting Network. Pat Robertson was my boss, and this was at a time when Pat was running for president in 1988. Wow. And when I joined CBN, I didn't know Pat was going to run for president. I don't think he knew either. So I was the White House correspondent, and here's my boss running for president, and I was trying to be a just the facts, ma'am journalist. And so to me, because I was trying to play it straight, and the perception was that I was just part of his campaign, and I wasn't. So I began to look for a new job, and I felt that by joining CBN, I had, in a sense, taken myself out of serious contention for mainstream journalism. But I had a friend who had been a producer at CBN, Jody Hassett, and she went on to ABC as a producer, but she got to CNN first. And I think arguably she helped grease the skids so that she had a good reputation as a journalist. And so when I said, I know Jody, then I was able to at least get an interview, do a writing test, and got hired.
So working with Wolf Blitzer, were you intimidated, have a healthy respect? I just think for myself, sometimes I become a fanboy and I get overwhelmed. But for you, did you just know your skills and you just put out your best work and it was well received?
Well, I think that it's sort of a double-edged sword in journalism, and especially in broadcast journalism, because it's sort of performance oriented, and in a sense, you're only as good as your last script or your last piece. So there's a fair amount of insecurity, I think, that goes along with it. But at the same time, when you are encouraged, when people say you're a good writer, then that helps. I think encouragement goes a long way to help give you the confidence to go forward. So by the time I met Wolf and was working with him, I'd already worked with some big names and found that they're just people. And Wolf is a very welcoming, he's not a threatening kind of person. He's like a dad, really. And so he's a fun guy to work with, but he's a true journalist. He's actually a journalist's journalist, because more than anything, he cares about accuracy and the facts.
So the more I talk to people, interview people, just gain trust from individuals, I understand that identity is a huge deal, that sometimes people are not as self-aware as others would like them to be. When did you become self-aware to be comfortable in your own skin?
Ooh, man. No one has ever asked me that before, Jeff. So congratulations. I think that's a really powerful question, because I think self-awareness, I know I've changed over the years, and I think that the arc of the change has been gradual. I think it started, I think, when I was probably a 19-year-old college student, and I became much more aware of my hedonism and my selfishness. I was confronted with evangelical Christianity and responded to the call, where I recognized that I needed to change, but I was unable to really bring it about by myself. Um, I would say that that change has gone on as I, read the scriptures, as I prayed, as I was in fellowship with other people. And I would say it intensified again when my youngest son died of a heroin overdose 9 years ago. And that was another time where I took a very serious look at myself. And so I became much more aware of the importance of being in the moment. Of, if we worry about the future or if we have regrets about the past, we can't control either of those things. The past has already happened. The future is not here yet. All we can control is the moment. And so I think a key thing of being self-aware is being self-aware at a time when you can really bring about change in your life and change in your circumstances.
That's so good. Again, John DeDakis, making some time, johndedakis.com. Bullet in the Chamber. Could you just share about this book?
Bullet in the Chamber is my fourth novel. And as you can maybe see that the cover, let's see, I have a picture of it here as well. The image of a bullet in the syringe I got when my son went missing. And he was missing for a week, and I knew heroin was probably involved. And so I just came up with that image, showing the Russian roulette powerfulness of heroin. And so I think I probably wrote the first draft maybe 8 months after he was found dead. And it was too soon to really write about it. And I went through grief counseling for about 2.5 years. And during that time, I think I became even more self-aware. And so basically what I did is I took the collateral damage that surrounds a grief like that, and I took the facts of when Stephen went missing and his addiction and the grief surrounding his death, and poured it into one of my Lark Chadwick novels. And so again, Lark is a White House correspondent. So I had characters that were already in existence. And so I just used Stephen's story and death as a subplot that added texture to Lark's life and poured that into a bigger story that was more of a mystery suspense thriller that, that was not necessarily related to my story, but I was able to write as a catharsis and at the same time bring my series forward by writing another book.
How old were you when Stephen passed away?
Let's see. Stephen died in 2011, so I was 61 at the time. Is that right? Yeah. Math is not my strong suit. I think I was 60. I was old.
How did your faith play a role in that tragedy?
I don't know. Because I think if I've learned anything about that kind of intensive grief, I think I realized that spirituality and the spirit world is vast. And I think that it's hard to put God in a box. I know that people of faith were supportive in their prayers. I know also that evangelicalism can be very narrow because Stephen was not, by definition, he had not accepted Christ. So by definition, then, doesn't it mean that he's in hell? Well, I'm a father and I knew of his heroin addiction and I didn't kick him out of the house. I loved him and I tried to help him get help for himself so that he could change his life. And so I think at that point, my faith, I re-examined my faith, I guess you could say. I became what I called spiritually unmoored, but I knew where the pier was. And so I think I was I think I became less dogmatic, less doctrinaire about my faith. I didn't jettison Christianity. I think for a while I wasn't sure about it. I didn't jettison it, but I think I became more embracing of the fact that spirituality and God, I think, manifests in ways that are not easily quantified or put in a box. And so I would say that my faith has I don't know, it's settled down, I guess. There's more peace involved in my faith, more acceptance of reality, more love toward other people and acceptance of other people. So, how's that for groping my way toward an answer?
Well, I think that's good. And I also think it's a sign of maturity that we understand that God is so vast and so big that we can't explain it, in such a small way. Now you have the ability and the forum just to share with so many and help them write. What type of joy does that give you, knowing that you're investing in other writers and helping them bring out a great product, but you yourself play a role behind the scenes in doing so?
Thank you. That is one of those surprise, serendipitous situations about life where you discover that once you've learned the craft, once you've learned how to write, how to find an agent, get published, I made a lot of mistakes along the way and learned from them. And my mom was a third grade teacher, so I learned how to teach. I guess I have the teaching gene, but I think probably at its root is encouragement. I mentioned that before. And so what I try to do I'm a manuscript editor, I'm a writing coach, I'm a workshop leader. And so all of these things bring together the expertise that I've amassed over the years, coupled with the encouragement that's just, I think, temperament, to help people gain the confidence and the skills to access whatever stories they have to tell. I help them be able to, in a sense, harness them and put them on the page. And so that's just a great source of joy for me, to see that light bulb go off in someone's life where they realize they thought they didn't have the discipline, they thought they didn't have the skill, and then to realize, whoa, I really can do this.
John, could you just share a little bit from your understanding in the power of story?
Well, I think probably the most important thing about story that makes it powerful is that it's about people. And often it's about people in conflict or people who are trying to solve problems, whether it's mystery, solving the murder, whether it's romance, solving the problem of loneliness and aloneness, coming together. Every story has people in it, has engaging characters. And I think one of the joys of life, one of the frustrations of life going forward in life is figuring ourselves out. You mentioned, becoming self-aware. And I think that as we come, I think the essence of becoming a good storyteller is to understand yourself. And the better you understand yourself, I think the more that will inform your storytelling, because it will make your characters authentic. And it even goes so far as to making your villains more authentic, as opposed to just cardboard cutouts of evil personified. Because think of the villains in your life. Chances are they presented themselves with their best foot forward. Yeah. You may even have married them. So a good writer is going to be empathetic and to bake redeeming qualities into their villains so that it reflects more accurately real life.
That's very good. And I've heard it said that blind spots are blind to you, but obvious to everyone else. Who have you had in your life to help point out those blind spots? And when did you really want that to be a part of your life? What I'm saying is, my son's a freshman in college. I love him to death, but he's still an 18-year-old boy that doesn't think he has any blind spots. So how important is it that we bring people that we trust to share those with us?
Well, I love you've got really insightful questions. And I would say probably the very first person in my life to point out my blind spots was my mom. My mom was she was a teacher. And so she was able to, whenever I would throw a tantrum or want my own way, she had her way of saying, you just like being mad, she'd say. And there was one moment where she really got my attention. I must have been 18 or 19. I was using drugs at the time, not hard drugs, but I was not a nice person. And she basically said, John, I love you, but I don't like you.
Hmm.
And that got my attention. And I would say then the other person in my life who fulfills that role of pointing out the dark side and the shadow side is my wife, Cindy. Cindy and I have been married 42 years,
Wow.
but we've known each other 43. And I think the reason that we get along so well is that, she's unimpressed with a lot of things that other people are impressed with. And she is able to tell me what I need to know, not what I want to know.
That's so important. And congratulations. My wife and I just celebrated 19 years. And so we're getting closer. So I just think about so many people, authors that I've listened to, they said that they have written more books than they have read. I assume that is not the case for you. What is it about reading? Who do you like to read? Do you read fiction or do you read more biographies? What's your go-to?
My go-to is nonfiction. I like political. I like, for instance, Bob Woodward's Rage, which is the most recent book that he wrote about the Trump presidency. I'm reading a book called Humankind, which is Rutger Bregman, I think, is the author. I think he's Dutch, and basically, it's a look at, are we basically good or evil? And it's a very intriguing read. So nonfiction is sort of my go-to, but I've gained an appreciation for fiction during an American history class that I took in college, and we were studying the Dust Bowl, but one of the books that was assigned was John Steinbeck's The Grapes of Wrath, and it was great because it personified the people within the Dust Bowl, and it made the dry facts of history come alive. And so that was a moment where I discovered a new kind of reading. So Steinbeck, like John Grisham, I mean, I'm not as well read as I'd like to be, but I like the writers who are able to write lean and at the same time bring you into a story and just sort of take you by the lapels and drag you along so that you're compelled to turn the page and not turn out the lights.
That's really good. I've always talked about writing a book. I don't know if I ever would, but when I talk about writing more of a fictional memoir where it's true life stories, but if it was presented in a real life book, people would say, that has to be fiction. Is that kind of how you write your books, that there's so many factual things that you include, but sometimes people wouldn't understand them for the content which you want?
The axiom in writing is write what you know. And one of the things I encourage my students is to draw from personal experience, whether it's the big pivotal experiences of your life or even the tactile details of the granular details of your life. All of those things are unique to you and you know them better than anybody else. There are a lot of people who take my class who are interested in writing memoir because they have been told, oh, you've got a great story, you should tell it. The problem with that is that once you start writing your story, there are a lot of things you don't know. And a lot of the people who could answer those questions are dead. Yeah. And so you find very quickly there's a limit to what you know and can write. The other thing is, if there are villains, you might get sued. Yeah. And so my suggestion is take the story from your life, tell the capital T truth, but you can change the small t details and still tell that capital T truth. But you get to make things up in a way that your imagination allows you to fill in some of the factual details that you'll never be able to learn. But you can imagine what it might have been like for Grandma and Grandpa back in 1908, because people are still people. And so the more you bring your own sense of self and have it meet history, you can then, I think, make a real story into something that is just as real, but it's also made up.
And again, John DeDakis, making some time. We have a couple more questions, then we'll get you out. Thank you again for being generous this holiday season. I can't believe it's already here, but johndedakis.com is where you can find more information. When I started this YouTube channel, which I've turned into a podcast and been so fortunate to have gracious, generous guests like yourself, I found a couple things common in the themes, and that is everyone's experienced some sort of adversity and required the need for resiliency. And now I look for those aspects as I interview different guests like yourself, as you mentioned, the loss of your son tragically. When you interview people, have you found a common theme as well, whether it crosses authors or athletes, celebrities? What is something that you found in common as you speak to so many people?
One of the things I discover, and this often surprises me, is that even people who are very either famous or who are skilled have had experiences of self-doubt. And that surprised me. That surprises me. And often I think that the more successful a person is, the more they've come to grips with self-doubt. And often self-doubt and self-criticism go hand in hand, because we can be our own worst enemy. We can talk ourselves out of doing a lot of things because we don't think we're good enough. I would say, arguably, to be honest, I didn't become a lawyer because I didn't think I could cut it in law school. And journalism and broadcast journalism was just easier for me. So it turned out okay, but I'll never know how things would have gone if I'd actually decided to become a lawyer. And I come across people all the time who have experienced and to a certain degree have overcome self-doubt. And so that's been one of the things that I have discovered as I try on people and the choices they've made and the decisions that they've made that have gotten them to where they are now.
And so at the time of this recording, it's the 10th of December, 2020, and our current president has filed some indication that he does not want to allow the president-elect to become president. Not saying I will agree, but John, your perspective, what does a country need to be more unified, especially after this election?
I'm glad you asked that question, because that's been a struggle for me for the last 4 or 5 years, because my kids did not know my political affiliations at all. And I retired from CNN in 2013. And when Trump started running for president in 2015 is when I first started taking a stand to resist him, because I felt he did not have integrity. I did not think he was an honest person. And so I fought against that. And I had numerous battles with people on Facebook trying to reach common ground, trying to, try to persuade people that, change your ways. And I discovered that more often than not, I was trying to lob rhetorical artillery shells into the enemy camp, thinking that, it would explode and then magically their opinions would change. I'm finding that it doesn't work that way. I'm also finding that it is incredibly difficult now, maybe even now more than ever, to find common ground with other people. And I think going forward, I am trying to dial back my anti-Trump posts. I'm trying to find the humanity in other people, because I think that maybe there may not be common ground politically, but I think there's still common ground that we can find on a human basis, because we all care about our prosperity. We all care about our health. We all care about our well-being. And I think that if we can start to focus on the other person's humanity and dignity, as opposed to demonizing them because they don't hold, the right opinion, or at least they don't agree with us politically, if we can put the politics aside and look for the common humanity, I think that may be the way to get back to civility and going forward, I think just a better atmosphere for the body politic in general.
Well, I certainly agree with that. John DeDakis, Instagram is at DeDakis John, Twitter, it's John DeDakis. And a couple questions, and we'll get you out. And it's simply, if you were cast to play a role in a movie, a feature film, would you personally want to play the hero or the villain?
I don't know. I don't know. I'll leave that up to the director and the casting agent.
All right.
I'll consider anything.
Not that you ask, but I will give you my answer. And maybe it's because my vocation is a pastor. And if it's a fictional movie, then I would certainly want to play the villain just because.
Why? Why?
I think it would be fun. And I think you could allow people to see that you are not perfect, where sometimes they gentle that is so untrue. And I think that'd be a great way to do so. And the final question, I stole this from Hernando Planos. He has a Be Contagious podcast. I love the guy, great coach, basketball guy all around. But he asks, if or when the feature film is made about your life, who plays you in that feature film?
I don't know. I have no idea.
And then I will give you my answer while you think there's a second part to this question. I always say, because we look so much alike, tongue in cheek, I say Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson. And my wife kind of just shakes her head at that. She would prefer Denzel Washington, but I would say Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson for myself.
Yeah. Well, I look a little like Mandy Patinkin now, so he can certainly, I'd be in good hands with him, I think.
And then the second part to that question is, who plays your love interest in that feature film about your life?
So many possibilities, so little time.
Well, that's after 42 years of marriage. I don't want to get you in trouble, but I think that'd be a great way. John, thank you so much for making the time. JohnDeDakis.com. The latest book that you've written is Fake, and we just are so encouraged by your honesty, vulnerability, and a time with us.
Thank you, Jeff.
Thank you so much. We wish you all the best.
And you.
And again, that's John DeDakis. Make some time. My name is Jeff Fuller. You can certainly find this podcast and others, Jay Fuller Interviews, on YouTube, the Facebook group, Instagram, and Twitter, and on all the podcast channels as the Backfire Podcast with Jeff Fuller of Jay Fuller Interviews. We thank you so much, and happy holidays. Enjoy this wonderful winter season.